SeaWorld Orlando, 2009, 50,000 people a day walking through the entrance. Balloons, ice cream, music, children running to the front row of the show. And at the center of it all, a 12,000-pound orca named Tilikum, performing jumps and tricks while crowds stood and applauded. The most photographed animal in the park, the most famous, the most profitable, the face of SeaWorld for decades. What those 50,000 people a day did not know, what SeaWorld knew and chose not to say was that Tilikum had already been involved in the deaths of 2 people before arriving at that pool in Orlando, and that in the years that followed, he would show clear, repeated, and documented signs that something was deeply wrong, before killing a third person in front of security cameras on an ordinary day in February. This is not the story of a killer whale, it is the story of a company that sold happiness, using an animal that was destroying itself from the inside, and how many times everything almost happened before it finally did. Tilikum was born in 1981 in the waters north of Iceland. Wild orcas live in matrilineal family groups, the mother at the center, sons and daughters around her, a social structure that in some ways is more cohesive and long-lasting than most human family structures. Male offspring remain with their mothers for their entire lives, they never separate. The bond is so strong that adult male orcas whose mothers die show a documented increase in mortality in the following years. They essentially die from grief. In November 1983, when Tilikum was approximately 2 years old, an Icelandic capture operation using nets trapped a group of orcas in a bay. Tilikum was separated from his mother, literally torn away from the only social group he had ever known and placed into a transport tank. The mother and the rest of the group remained outside the net, vocalizing. Orca vocalizations during family separation situations are documented as different from normal vocalizations. Longer, more intense, at frequencies researchers describe as distress calls. Tilikum's mother stayed around the net for hours after her son was removed. Tilikum was 2 years old, he never saw his mother again. Tilikum's destination was Sealand of the Pacific, a marine park in Victoria, in Canada's British Columbia. It was not SeaWorld, it was a smaller park with limited resources and management standards that today would be illegal in any developed jurisdiction. Tilikum was placed in a pool with 2 adult female orcas, Haida 2 and Nootka 4, who already lived there. Orcas in wild groups have complex hierarchies established over many years. Throwing a young recently captured male, without a family group, without established status, into a pool with 2 adult females from different groups was a recipe for conflict. Haida and Nootka regularly attacked Tilikum. In the wild, orca conflicts have a natural resolution. The subordinate animal moves away, increases the distance, leaves the dominant animal's territory. In a 100-foot pool, there is nowhere to go. Tilikum received scratches and tooth marks that healed only to be replaced by new ones. The park's records documented regular aggression. At night, Sealand's protocol was to place the 3 orcas in a smaller holding pool, approximately 26 feet in diameter, where they remained until the park opened in the morning. 26 feet in diameter for 2 adult orcas, and Tilikum, who eventually reached 23 feet in length. A wild orca swims an average of 100 miles a day in the ocean. At Sealand, he swam in circles until the park opened. Tilikum spent 8 years under those conditions. February 20, 1991, Kelty Byrne was 21 years old. She was a marine biology student and worked as a trainer at Sealand. During a training session, she slipped and fell into the pool with the 3 orcas. What happened in the following minutes was documented by witnesses and later investigations. The orcas, Tilikum, Haida, and Nootka, would not let Kelty get out. Whenever she tried to swim to the edge of the pool, they pulled her back to the center. She was kept in the water for approximately 10 minutes while employees tried to distract the whales and rescue her. She drowned. The investigation could not determine which of the 3 orcas initiated the behavior or which one was directly responsible for the death. All 3 were involved. Tilikum was identified as a participant, but not as the sole cause. Sealand of the Pacific closed less than a year later, not as a direct regulatory consequence of Kelty's death, but because the owner decided to sell. The buyer of the orcas was SeaWorld. In January 1992, Tilikum was transferred to Orlando, Florida. SeaWorld knew about the Kelty Byrne incident when they bought Tilikum. They bought him anyway because Tilikum was the largest male orca in captivity in the world, and his genetic material was extraordinarily valuable for the breeding program. Tilikum eventually fathered 21 calves born in captivity, representing a significant portion of all captive orcas in the world. The decision to buy Tilikum despite his history was documented in internal SeaWorld emails later uncovered during legal proceedings. The company bought the animal, chose not to publicly disclose his history, and put trainers to work with him. Orlando was bigger than Victoria. The main SeaWorld pool had dimensions that made Sealand look like a home aquarium. But bigger does not mean adequate, and for an orca accustomed to swimming 100 miles a day in the open ocean, the difference between a 100-foot pool and a 600-foot pool is the difference between 2 kinds of confinement, not between confinement and freedom. Tilikum arrived at SeaWorld with behaviors already established that animal welfare researchers today would immediately identify as signs of psychological distress. He swam in repetitive circles, a behavior seen in captive animals that is comparable to humans with severe trauma. He remained motionless at the surface for extended periods, a behavior called logging, which in healthy wild orcas is rare and brief. Tillicum's dorsal fin had completely collapsed, folded over on itself, unable to remain upright. In wild orcas, dorsal fin collapse is extremely rare, documented in less than 1% of the population. In captive orcas, the rate is close to 100%. The cause is physiological, lack of proper movement and constant exposure to the surface in shallow pools relative to the animal's size. But SeaWorld presented the collapsed fin as a normal variation to visitors who asked questions. It is not a normal variation, it is a documented consequence of inadequate confinement. SeaWorld knew that too. In the years following his arrival at SeaWorld, Tillicum participated in the shows, but with restrictions the trainers knew about and the public did not. Trainers were not allowed to enter the water with Tillicum, an internal rule established because of his history at Sealand. Interaction was done from the edge of the pool or from submerged platforms, never through free swimming with the animal. This created a peculiar situation for the audience. Tillicum appeared in the shows, performed tricks, received fish, and was presented as one of the park's main attractions, but the trainers who worked with him knew there was a line they would not cross, an invisible separation between the show the audience saw and the reality the employees knew. Meanwhile, Tillicum's genetic material was being actively used. Semen collection, artificial insemination of females across multiple SeaWorld parks. Tillicum became the founding father of an entire generation of captive orcas, his DNA spreading throughout the entire operation while he swam in circles in the same pool. The company that used his image to sell joy also used his biology to expand the business. That combination made any honest decision about what to do with him impossible. Releasing him was never considered. Orcas raised in captivity rarely survive release, and Tillicum had spent almost his entire adult life in pools. Removing him from the shows would reduce profitability. Continuing as things were kept the system running, so the system continued. July 6, 1999, SeaWorld employees arrived in the morning and found Daniel Duke's body in Tillicum's pool. Dukes was 27 years old and had hidden inside the park after closing hours. The exact cause of death was never definitively established. There were marks on the body consistent with orca trauma, but also severe hypothermia. The official version was accidental drowning with possible hypothermia. What is certain is that Dukes was inside Tillicum's pool without authorization, without protective gear, without any of the safety conditions professional trainers maintained, and he died. For SeaWorld, the incident was treated as trespassing that ended tragically, not as evidence that the animal was dangerous. Tillicum remained in the shows. The incident was not prominently disclosed. Most visitors in the following years had no idea it had happened. 2 deaths with documented or suspected involvement from Tillicum, no significant changes to protocol, no public disclosure of his history. Between 1999 and 2010, there are records of multiple incidents involving Tillicum that did not result in death. But when reviewed with the knowledge of what happened later, they form a progression that is disturbing to follow. Tillicum grabbed trainers by their clothing, pulled equipment, and maintained physical contact with trainers for longer than planned. In some incidents, emergency protocols were activated, separation gates dropping, rescue trainers moving into position before the situation resolved without serious injury. Every incident was documented internally, every report was classified. The trainers who worked with Tillicum knew his history because there were specific protocols for him that did not exist for the other orcas. But there was also a gradual normalization. Years of shows without a death created a comfort curve that safety researchers call normalization of deviance. Behaviors that should have been warning signs gradually became part of the routine. Tillicum was the biggest, the most famous, the most photographed. Every show had the same music, the same tricks, the same applause. The repetition created a sense of control. The sense of control was false, but convincing enough for the system to keep operating for years. February 24, 2010, Dawn Brancho was 40 years old and one of the most experienced and respected trainers at SeaWorld. She had worked with orcas for 15 years, knew Tillicum better than most park employees, and had participated in hundreds of sessions with him. After an afternoon show, during a slide-out session where the trainer lies on the edge of the shallow pool, in contact with the orca, Tillicum grabbed Dawn by the hair and pulled her into the water. What happened during the next 35 minutes was recorded by the park's security cameras. The footage was never released publicly, but it was described in detail during lawsuits and investigations by the American Occupational Safety Agency. Tillicum did not let Dawn go. He dragged her along the bottom of the pool. Other trainers tried to distract him with fish, sounds, and emergency procedures. He did not respond to the protocols. Dawn Brancho died from drowning combined with physical trauma. She was the most experienced trainer in the park with that specific animal. With 15 years of experience, deep knowledge of the animal, and the entire park safety team surrounding the pool, none of it was enough. Dawn Brancho's death could not be contained. There were witnesses. There were security cameras. There was an entire park full of visitors who saw the chaos of the emergency response even without understanding what had happened. SeaWorld released its first public statement hours later. The initial narrative, that Dawn had slipped and fallen into the pool, was contradicted by witnesses who saw Tillicum pull her in. SeaWorld revised the narrative, saying that Tillicum had grabbed the trainer, carefully avoiding the word attack. The American Occupational Safety Agency opened an investigation. They discovered that SeaWorld knew Tillicum's history, knew about the intermediate incidents, had classified internal documentation of all the events, and had allowed trainers to work with the animal without full disclosure of the risks. They fined SeaWorld $70,000, the maximum amount allowed by law for that type of violation, and determined that trainers could no longer enter the water with orcas without a physical protective barrier. SeaWorld challenged the ruling in court. The legal battle lasted for years. SeaWorld lost. In 2013, director Gabriella Cowperthwaite released Blackfish, a documentary about Tillicum and SeaWorld that used interviews with former trainers, internal records obtained through lawsuits, and archive footage to build the argument that SeaWorld had hidden the truth for decades. The documentary did not present anything that was undocumented. There were no unsupported claims. Every statement was backed by records, lawsuits, testimony, or internal documents. What Blackfish did was organize scattered information into a continuous narrative that made it impossible not to see the pattern. The impact was immediate and devastating for SeaWorld Entertainment. Artists canceled performances at the park, sponsors withdrew, the company's stock fell. Visitor attendance declined consistently for years after the release. School groups that had visited SeaWorld for decades canceled educational programs. SeaWorld responded with a campaign called The Truth About Blackfish, a website, advertisements, and public statements challenging the documentary's claims. Former employees who had been interviewed in Blackfish were systematically discredited. The company claimed the documentary was biased, taken out of context, and emotionally manipulative. None of it reversed the trend. The public had seen the pattern, and once seen, it could not be unseen. In March 2016, SeaWorld Entertainment announced that it would end its theatrical orca shows. Not immediately, there would be a transition to educational presentations where the orcas would still appear, but without the performative jumps and tricks. And the captive breeding program would be ended. The existing orcas would be the last generation bred in captivity by SeaWorld. The announcement was presented as a voluntary decision based on an evolving scientific understanding of animal welfare in captivity. Nobody who had followed the previous years believed it was voluntary. SeaWorld had lost approximately $1 billion in market value since the release of Blackfish. Visitor attendance had declined consistently. The cost of continuing the shows, in terms of reputation, ongoing lawsuits, and increasing regulation, had become greater than the benefit. The decision was economic. SeaWorld did not present it that way. While SeaWorld Entertainment was navigating its institutional crisis, Tillicum was dying. In 2016, the park announced that Tillicum was ill, a bacterial lung infection caused by Mycobacterium, an organism present in the environment, but one that healthy immune systems normally control. In immunosuppressed orcas, such as orcas with a history of long-term chronic stress, progressive infection is common. Tillicum spent his final months alternating between periods of logging, floating motionless at the surface for hours, and brief periods of activity. SeaWorld released periodic updates about his condition. The language focused on dedicated veterinary care and a team committed to his well-being. The irony was heavy enough to feel physical. The animal who had become the central cause of the park's reputational crisis was dying, while the park tried to rebuild the narrative that it cared about the welfare of the animals it kept. Tillicum died on January 6, 2017. He was approximately 35 years old. Wild male orcas live between 50 and 60 years on average. Tillicum died at roughly half the life expectancy of a wild animal from his species. SeaWorld published a statement of mourning, describing Tillicum as a majestic animal who had touched the lives of millions of people. It did not mention the 3 deaths. It did not mention the 35 years of confinement. It did not mention the collapsed dorsal fin, the stereotyped behaviors, or the documented incidents. It was a statement mourning the Tillicum that SeaWorld had presented to the public, not the Tillicum that had actually existed. SeaWorld Entertainment still exists today. The theatrical orca shows ended in San Diego in 2017 and in the other parks in the years that followed. The orcas are still in the pools. There is genuinely nowhere else to send them. Animals that have spent their entire lives in captivity do not have the hunting skills, navigation abilities, or social behaviors necessary to survive in the open ocean. The orcas SeaWorld keeps will die in the pools where they live because there is no viable alternative. The park repositioned itself: less entertainment, more conservation and education, marine animal rescue programs, partnerships with scientific organizations, and a narrative of transformation that the company actively promotes. Whether that transformation is genuine or sophisticated public relations depends on how each person sees it. That part is personal. Some people will see it as sincere, others will doubt it, but all of that is speculation. What does not change with the rebranding is what happened. Tillicum was captured at 2 years old. He spent 33 years in pools, lived through 2 facilities where the conditions produced behavior that resulted in deaths. He showed documented signs of suffering for decades, and died with half the natural life expectancy of his species. And during all that time, he was the most photographed, most applauded, and most profitable animal at one of the largest entertainment parks in the world. The story of Tillicum is not about an orca that became a killer. It is about what happens when you take an animal with enough cognitive and emotional capacity to suffer in complex ways. Remove everything that defines its natural existence, family, territory, movement, social autonomy, and place it in an environment designed to maximize profit from its presence. The suffering was documented, the signs were visible. The deaths were not surprises to the people who knew the history, they were consequences of a system that repeatedly chose profit over evidence. That does not make Tilikum a monster, it makes him a consequence. Millions of people applauded this orca every day without knowing that he had shown clear and repeated signs that something was deeply wrong. Not because the people were cruel or indifferent, but because the information was managed by a company that had a direct interest in keeping the public from knowing. The question that remains is not what Tilikum was, it is what the system that created him says about the choices people and companies make when money and evidence point in opposite directions. In this case, the answer was in the pools of SeaWorld Entertainment for 33 years, visible to anyone willing to see it.